I never planned on working with death. When I took the job at Aldridge Funeral Home, I thought it would be a practical step, decent pay, night shifts that would let me study during the day, and a kind of order routines, checklists, protocols that calmed me when the rest of life felt like loose ends. At 32, I already knew there was comfort in a predictable routine. I didn't expect the routine to come with color and smell. In my first month, everything seemed almost banal. Clean bags, sterilized gloves, IVs, labels, forms that looked like paperwork passed down through generations. The funeral director, a man named Mark with a radio voice and a look that assessed me continuously, taught me to fold funeral sheets with the same reverence you fold a flag. "Families remember the details," he would say, "and sometimes the detail is all they have left." There was reverence and technique, coldness and warmth. The place ran like a machine of human care, an industry of gestures. But funeral homes, I soon discovered, have corridors that fold over themselves like the past folded into paper. They are places where hours are staggered differently. The pre-dawn crushes the sounds of an entire day into a heavy silence, and the air always seems saturated with something that isn't only formaldehyde. At 3 a.m, with the fluorescent lamps on and the city asleep outside, the building hummed to its own rhythm. The crematorium fan, the reception clock, the distant murmur of the generator. Death has an acoustics. In the second month, I was given the first case that unmoored me. A man named Thomas, 52, lived alone in an old house by the river. Found by a neighbor who smelled it, the report said. He was a man with a history of depression and a curious habit of disappearing for days. The body arrived wrapped in a simple sheet, hands crossed over the chest, face expressionless. On the preparation table, under direct light, Thomas looked less like a turned-off body and more like someone who had fallen asleep too soon. Working on him required technique, cleansing, suturing, the unpleasant honesty of stains that don't hide under perfume. There was a cut on the left wrist, discreet, already coagulated. The report mentioned possible suicide, but for many relatives, as always, words rounded off and turned into silence. I did what they asked. Prepared, embalmed, painted hands with the color of life that convinces. I left the face calm, closed the mouth, combed the hair to one side. The family requested a simple viewing. There were flowers, the scented oil bottle that all rites include, and there was next to all that an anonymous note tucked among the envelopes. "Thank you for listening." The word listening stuck with me. What was there to hear from someone who no longer spoke? After Thomas, things changed subtly. I began to notice details that routine had previously allowed me to ignore. The position of the fingers when someone dies with clenched hands, small marks on the nape that only appear under intense light, the way a face ages during the hours between shutdown and care. A body is not only matter, it is an unfinished narrative. And in unfinished narratives, our imagination fills the gaps. It was on one of those pre-dawn shifts that I arrived at Aldridge and found the prep room door ajar. The air smelled heavier than usual, not only the mix of disinfectant and formaldehyde, but something sweet and almost metallic underneath, as if someone had left ripe fruit on a plate for days. The table held a body unlike the previous ones, a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, with loose black hair and a wrinkled white dress. There were no labels on the bench. The body seemed to have been brought in hastily. Beside her, a small, nearly consumed candle emitted a bluish flame, something I had never seen in an establishment that runs on protocols and electric power. Mark was on the phone, his voice dragging across cold terms. No one had logged the woman's arrival. No one had claimed her. I stepped closer to look. The candle was strange. It had no scent. And yet, as my eyes met the young woman's face, I felt a displacement, a mismatch between what I saw and what my memory wanted it to be. There were fine marks, almost like fingers, around her neck, disconnected from any straightforward explanation. The dress had mud stains, as if she'd been carried across plowed ground. And more unsettling, a small ribbon tied to her right wrist, a pink ribbon with its tip singularly singed. Mark hung up and gave me a look that wasn't the same as before. "There's no family," he said. "It arrived anonymously. Nobody knows anything." His voice was an act of defense. "We'll catalog it, Doc. You handle the registry. I'll notify the police." While he spoke, I felt the hairs on my arm rise, not from cold, but like when someone passes by and you recognize an old scent. I began to work with the hands that knew the gestures, but my mind was already looking for reasons my training could not supply. Who was that young woman? The report will vanish, I thought, because houses of death learn to turn questions into forms. But the pink ribbon looked at me like an enigma. Why was it burned at the tip? Why did the candle have a blue flame? Small elements became doors. That night, turning off the lights and crossing the empty reception, I heard a sound thin, almost like a snap coming from the prep room. I intended to go back, but Mark gave me a squeeze on the shoulder. "Go home, kid. Tomorrow's when we finish." His voice sounded more human than the stock phrases we used with families. I left with wind cutting my face and the bitter sense that there was something technique could not address. At home, my clothes still smelled of the funeral home. I tried to shower, read a bit, make the small noise that convinces the mind things are as before, but the young woman's face kept appearing, as if the candle's blue light had transferred to my retina. I slept with the window ajar and woke sweating. There was a message on my phone, a photo taken in an unnamed corridor. It looked like Aldridge itself, and on it, in crooked handwriting, a sentence: "She isn't alone. No number, no ID." I felt the ground give. The message could be a sick joke, someone with too much time. But the nature of our work had taught me that life and death speak in subtleties, and sutures, I knew, aren't just stitches in skin. They are also what we try to sew into our understanding when something doesn't fit. I returned to work in a state of inexplicable fear, the fear that does not scream, it just tightens the chest. The police eventually came in the morning, asked routine questions, discreetly photographed the body, and took the few fingerprints they could from it. Everything else was filed under a protocol: unidentified, anonymous entry, possible public exposure. While the officers did their work, Mark was aloof, as if suspended on a wire between administrative caution and a deeper fatigue. After they left, he called me into his office and closed the door. "Don't tell clients who come to pick up relatives," he said. "We care for people, not stories. But look, if it bothers you, tell me. I don't want you carrying this alone." His hand passed over a catalog, and for a second I saw a man who genuinely worried. I wanted to trust him and thought perhaps what gripped me was only the sight, the odd candle, the burned ribbon things that, when explained, lose their voice. I went back to the prep room with a notepad. I wrote everything down: the blue candle, the pink ribbon with its singed tip, the feeling of being watched. I began the protocol, the chart, the records, standard angled photographs of the body. I untied the ribbon on the woman's wrist with care, preserving the charred tip. It was fragile, fine cotton, the fibers coming loose to the touch as if they'd been through hot water. I pulled a lock of hair and sealed it in a plastic bag. Everything that might serve as a clue I packed and labeled. That afternoon, Mark arrived with a man I hadn't seen before. A middle-aged fellow with light eyes and a brown overcoat, who introduced himself as a private investigator hired by a family that had not formally come forward, people who like to know what doesn't appear in reports, he explained. He had a gaze that weighed everything. He asked if he could see the body. I nodded. As I guided the investigator among the cold cabinets and jars of formalin, the blue candle returned in my mind, a reflex that made my steps feel lighter, as if the floor didn't quite hold me. The investigator stopped, examined the dress, the marks on the neck, the ribbon. "This is ritualistic," he murmured in a tone neither legal nor mystical, simply observant. "I can't say what cult, if you can call it that. Something with fire, see here, the burn on the ribbon and a candle that burns blue. Not common. Have you worked with bodies with this kind of thing?" I shook my head. He made a note and lifted his chin. "Watch your dreams. Usually what we don't understand by day, we see at night." The sentence stuck like a stone. I'd had strange dreams when I first started the job, blurry images, corridors that weren't on the building's blueprints, but it was different now. Dreams arriving with smell and texture. That night I dreamed I walked into the prep room and the blue candle trembled with a flame full of eyes. The young woman sat on a chair, facing me, and had no eyes. In their place were two surfaces so black they seemed to swallow light. She smiled, a movement impossible in a corpse, and asked, without sound, that I listen to her. I woke, gasping, and there was a smear of ash on the pillow. The next days were suffocating. Small, absurd things happened often. Instruments that had been stored appeared on the prep table as if dropped by hurried hands. The scale needle registered a different weight when I checked twice. The records room lock turned itself at midnight, and with that made an electrical click that ran through the building. A colleague, Rosa, who worked reception, began avoiding the prep wing. "I don't like that candle," she confided. "When I pass by it, I feel like crying for no reason." I thought it was empathy amplified by fear, until one night I found a fingertip-shaped mark, small and warm, stamped on my forehead when I looked in the bathroom mirror. There was no blood, only a finger pattern as if someone had touched me and forgotten to take the warmth. I started researching discreetly. I looked up blue candles and burned ribbons in forums and articles, read about folk rituals, urban superstitions, and marginalized rites. There were explanations ranging from the chemical to the symbolic. Blue candles can indicate combustion with copper traces, suggesting tampering. Burned ribbons appear in passage rituals and historically marked pacts where one burned an end to seal something. Nothing fully convinced me. The most solid information came from an old book of popular funerary practices that Mark kept on a dusty shelf. "Gestures people make when they condense grief," the crooked title read. There was a reference. When grief is too large for the ritual manifests in humble objects, ribbons, shoes, candles, as if they were reminders returned. I read it and felt my stomach go thick. One night, sleepless, I checked the prep room because I couldn't stand the silence. The window was ajar and a vaporous breeze came in, carrying the scent of river and rotten flowers. The blue candle was out, but there was a ring of soot on the spot where it had been denser than normal, blacker. When I touched it, the soot nestled on my finger like coal dust. Pulling my hand back, I noticed something scratched into one of the bench boards, an inscription I didn't remember seeing before. A name. At first, I thought it was a varnish flaw. I leaned close and read, in small crooked letters, Thomas. It froze me. Thomas, the riverside man I'd prepared weeks earlier, appeared there, carved into the wood near that unknown body. I thought of memory leaks, how names repeat in uncertain places, but this was too specific. I flipped back through my notebook and recalled the note found in an envelope left at Thomas's viewing. "Thank you for listening." The word listening recurred. There were connections reason hesitated to stitch together. I found myself thinking that somehow the funeral home was accumulating unmet requests, voices nesting in cuts and folds, and that now, as if an invisible tape stretched taut, these requests touched objects and bodies. The next morning, Mark arrived with a letter the private investigator had left on the counter. "Return my listening devices," it read in large, trembling letters. Nonsense. Inside the letter, I found a small metal blade with inscriptions, sharp and wrapped in cloth. Sewn into the cloth was a pink ribbon. My stomach turned. This was too symbolic to be coincidence. The investigator, when contacted, denied leaving it. He said the material had been handed to him by anonymous people who preferred not to be identified. The police laughed at my ritual hypothesis. Mark began sleeping with the prep room key in his pocket. That same night, I woke with the sensation of someone standing beside the bed. The room was dark except for a sliver of streetlight. The breath I felt near my face was warm and mixed with the odor of formalin and earth. I tried to move my eyes, but my eyelids seemed glued by an invisible adhesive. The breathing became a thin puff at my ear, and a voice, so close I thought I imagined it, whispered my name. "Listen." It was only one syllable, but when I finally moved, the window slammed in the wind, and on the headboard lay a piece of pink ribbon with its tip darkened by fire, exactly like the one I had removed from the young woman's wrist. I trembled until dawn. The next day, I returned to work with a new secret. Carrying something inexplicable is the threshold of madness. I started noting everything in a notebook: times, smells, vibrations. I gave a copy to the investigator because I needed to share the weight. He read in silence and returned the notebook with a short comment. "They're looking for something we don't have, but perhaps if we pay attention, we can return what they ask for." At that pace, the funeral home ceased to be only a job. It became a place where memories manifested in objects and smoke, where grief and forgetting battled over trays and candles. I realized, with a fear now consolidated, that the only thing that might calm it was again listening. Not with ears, but with care. Recording with patience, returning names with the attention that had been lacking. And so I began spending nights beside the young woman's body, and speaking softly as if the room were a small congregation. I recited names from records, read old letters from the archive, read pages from Thomas's notebook. Each word seemed to push the smoke back a little, but it never disappeared. Somewhere deep in the building, something whispered around the ventilation pipes as if it were listening.